In the First World War, Britain pioneered the use of an important weapon, the tank. Nothing like it had ever been seen on the battlefield before. In 1918, it helped the British armies in France to crush the Germans. By spring 1940, Germany completely turned the tables on its enemies by unleashing a merciless Panzer thrust in France. Not only did this bring the nation to its knees, but it forced the British to flee the continent, leaving its tanks on the beaches at Dunkirk. This episode shows how Britain surmounted technical, tactical and financial problems to produce a tank that could take on the most formidable weapons in the world, the Cromwell. Between 1914 and 1918, both aircraft and tanks had become important weapons of war. The tank was developed by the British in 1915 and was first used on the 15th of September 1916. Its debut was far from successful, and it was hampered by all kinds of problems.
The British invented the tank, and by 1917 they were very good at its use. Now initially, when it first comes in 1916, it's very primitive, there aren't enough of them, it's mechanically unreliable, but it's a start, and like all new weapon systems, it takes time for it to come to be really of much use. But by 1917 it was very good. By 1918, only the British have got a workable battle tank, as opposed to an upgunned armoured car.
Tanks in the First World War didn't have turrets, as you see on these tanks here. They had sponsons mounted on the side of the hull. This was for two purposes. Firstly, you needed the weapon mounted quite low so you could fire down into trenches as you passed over them. But also, the primary design characteristic of First World War tanks was predicated around their ability to cross trenches and large obstacles. To do this, they needed to have a thing called an unditching beam on the top. It's a large beam of wood that would go into the trench. If it got lodged in the trench, it could lever itself up. And you couldn't have a turret on the top if you were going to have that.
Crews were working often in temperatures of 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It was very hot, very unpleasant. The atmosphere was laden with petrol fumes and carbon monoxide. Mechanical reliability was also a very major problem. In the early versions, the tracks quite often snapped. So there were numerous problems with these things when they were first introduced. And some of these problems were never altogether solved in the whole course of the war.
By the second half of 1917, some British officers were dismissing the tank as an expensive failure. But the Battle of Cambrai on the 20th of November 1917 proved them completely wrong.
The big opportunity to use the tank as the tank designers intended was at Cambrai in 1917, when a large number of tanks broke through the German lines, so without prior artillery bombardment, taking the enemy by surprise, using good ground rather than the very poor ground, and a large breakthrough happened. It was here that the inherent problem of the tank came through, that it wasn't fast enough, and the attack collapsed, though it showed the promise of the tank.
The tank's performance at Cambrai showed that when deployed in large numbers, on suitable ground, and with the benefit of surprise, they could be used effectively. Not only did the performance of the British tanks show what could be achieved, but it was enough to boost the flagging confidence of the infantry and of British High Command. Tanks did not win the First World War for the Allies, yet the improved tanks available in the second half of 1918 made a significant contribution to victory. Victories that forced the Germans to sign the humiliating armistice of the 11th of November 1918.
I think the difficulty was that it was seen by the public as being much more than it actually was. It was seen by the public as being a war-winning weapon. It was seen by many of the politicians as being a war-winning weapon. Now, the army knew it wasn't. It was a very useful adjunct to the infantry and the artillery. It was something that could cross obstacles. It was something that could create gaps in German wire. It was something that could give intimate fire support to the infantry. But it was never going to be a war-winning weapon.
Were they an infantry support weapon? Were they a replacement for the cavalry? Did we want big tanks? Did we want little tanks? Big tanks would be expensive to build and we could only have a few of them. Small tanks would be limited in capability. Yes, there was an enormous debate. And what was the tank supposed to do? Was it supposed to fight other tanks? Was it supposed to fight infantry? Was it in fact supposed to be a strategic weapon that disappeared way beyond the enemy's lines and really in fact almost by its very presence caused the enemy to collapse, to withdraw?
Most of the lessons, ironically, were learnt by the Germans, who didn't invent the tank, who only made one tank of their own, which was a complete failure. But the lesson they took was that although armour wasn't a war-winning weapon now, it might be in the future. Now, if you're a German, you have to win a war very quickly. And if you don't win it at all. And that's a factor of where Germany is geographically. Now, the German soldiers saw that something like the tank might enable them to win battles very quickly. What they didn't want to do was ever again get bogged down into a battle or a war of attrition, which inevitably they would lose.
Until the early 1930s, the British were the world leaders in the development of tanks and in military ideas about their use. During the 1930s, however, this lead slipped away as other countries devoted far more money and industrial capacity to tank development. As a result, Britain was far from prepared when Germany unleashed its Blitzkrieg on France in 1940. The outcome was devastating.
Blitzkrieg rolls through France. Actually, the British and the French between them had more tanks than the Germans, and in most cases they had better tanks. The difference was that the Germans knew how to use them, and the British didn't.
The development of British armoured forces and technical development of British tanks goes badly wrong in the early 30s. One of the reasons for this, the simplest reason, is that there's a massive government financial cut in 1931. These fall particularly heavily on the army. The Great Depression has a rather different impact on Germany, because what it does in Germany, of course, is to bring Adolf Hitler to power in 1933. And what then happens is that the German government gives absolutely massive priority to its army.
The Germans had carried out a secret tank development program in conjunction with the Russians, strangely enough, in the Soviet Union. And that was secret, and not much was known about that outside Germany and the Soviet Union. But post Hitler coming to power, he was keen to show the rise of the German armed forces and was very keen to show off what he was developing and how good his tanks, his Panzers were going to be.
Britain's armoured division, made up mostly of light and infantry tanks, was annihilated before France finally fell in 1940. Although most of the men escaped, every tank was abandoned. The years of indecision and thrift that had blighted British tank development came back to haunt the War Office. Faced with the overwhelming power and flexibility of the German Panzer divisions, Britain's military strategists were forced to rethink tank doctrine, training, and equipment. It was a rude awakening.
Enormous number of rumours came out of this, the sort of the mythical invincibility of German tanks, when they were in fact quite the reverse and not at all as good as British and French tanks. It's interesting that the Russians II, got taken in by a lot of German propaganda, and this is what started the race to increase tank gun calibre throughout the war. In fact, the British never really caught up with.
The Germans knew exactly what we were up to. They frequently visited England, official, formal, properly constituted visits. They came over, they looked at this armoured division, they looked at how it worked, they talked to the British who were using it, they learnt a lot from it, they took those lessons back and they applied them to their own development of armoured doctrine, which, as I say, they were carrying out largely in Russia.
The Germans were sort of actually behind the Russians, and but they were well ahead of us by the time we came to meet them in force.
By the early 1940s, tanks were being ordered straight from the drawing board into mass production. With no time for testing, cruisers were put through their paces on the battlefield, often with disastrous results. At the start of the war, there were more casualties as a result of breakdowns than of enemy fire. The several years it took to get from design to manufacture also meant that British tanks entered the battlefield much later than they were really needed. This time lag meant that models emerging at the start of the war were always one step behind their German counterparts.
I think there was a confusion inside the army as to what exactly was required for any future mechanised warfare. And in the end, the British took the view that they needed a bit of everything, so there was an attempt was made to design a range of tanks which would do individual jobs on the battlefield rather than attempt to produce one type of tank that could do everything effectively.
The British were really trying to develop two distinct types of tank. Light tanks, which were mainly for reconnaissance purposes, and medium tanks, which were supposed to do really all the different kinds of fighting.
I think the British were logical about what they were doing. What the British didn't do was, when it became apparent very early in the war that this wasn't working, they didn't quickly adjust what they were trying to do and change their design and production, the way they went about producing tanks. So it's an inability to adjust to changing situations during the very early part of the war, I think, that was a problem.
The Crusader served the British forces in the North Africa campaign until the arrival of the American Grant tanks. But at the end of a very long chain of cruiser development throughout the war, emerged a tank that not only earned respect and affection among British tank crews, but propelled British tank technology to the world's Premier League, the Cromwell.
Discover the past with exclusive military history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians, all on History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to watch everything, from the gripping story of the Band of Brothers to Operation Barbarossa and D-Day. Immerse yourself in the dramatic stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Manned by a crew of 6, the A9 started life as a medium tank, a classification that was changed to that of cruiser. The A9 mounted a 2-pounder gun, 3 7.65mm machine guns and a 3-inch howitzer. Its AEC engine was capable of a range of 150 miles, 150 brake horsepower and a top road speed of 25 miles per hour. Although early testing proved the tank to be overweight, with a tendency to come off its tracks, Vickers worked on it for another year, and by 1939, models were being delivered to France, Egypt, and Greece. But the supply problems that had dogged the A9's development were far from over. Models were being issued without their 2-pounder guns, while those with guns were not supplied with ammunition. There were no spare parts, no tools, and few soldiers were trained to operate or maintain them.
The A9 had a very confused origin. It was originally designed from a requirement in 1934 for an infantry tank, a tank to support infantry. And in many ways, this is why it had the two rather unwieldy machine gun turrets and the very large crew that it had. It was actually used as a cruiser. By the time we had defined what we wanted to do with tanks, we had decided that it was too large, too expensive, and a little bit too mobile for use as an infantry tank.
The A9 had a very reliable suspension, and it was armed with a 2-pounder gun. It was reasonably adequate for the campaigns it fought in.
It had a few limitations as a cruiser tank. The suspension was not designed for high speeds. It was a very good system, but it was a low-speed system. It wasn't sufficiently powerful.
The armour on the A9 was really very thin. I think there were teething troubles too with mechanical reliability to begin with.
It couldn't fire a high explosive shell, so if it found itself on the battlefield in a situation where it was faced with an enemy that was anything other than an enemy tank, it couldn't really do anything. So it was not very good against enemy anti-tank positions, for example.
But again, we don't really know how to use them. Even if it had as good a gun as the German tanks, even if it was as reliable, until we, the British, learn how to use our tanks, how to integrate them with anti-tank guns, with infantry, with artillery, we're never going to get anywhere.
At the same time as the A9 was undergoing development, the War Office started to look forward to the next generation of cruiser tanks. So in 1936, the British War Office sent officers on a fact-finding mission to the Soviet Union. Their discoveries revolutionized British tank design. What impressed them most was the outstanding off-road performance of the Russian BT tanks that incorporated a suspension system designed by the American inventor J. Walter Christie. The US War Office had rejected Christie's designs, and it was only as the war progressed that his concept became recognized as one of the biggest innovations in tank design. By 1936, not only were Russian tanks capable of hitting 40 miles per hour, but they were infinitely more reliable, and as a result, most remained in service. After this report, the British War Office commissioned the Nuffield Mechanisation Company, the tank-building arm of the Morris Group, to begin work on a fast cruiser tank based on the Christie suspension system. By December 1938, the first models of the A-15 cruiser tank were leaving the production line. The A-15 evolved to replace the aging 1930s A-9 as the British Army's main cruiser tank. The A-15, otherwise known as the Crusader, had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 2-pounder gun and two 7.92mm Beezer machine guns. The Crusader's armour was up to 40mm thick. Its Nuffield Liberty engine was capable of a range of 100 miles, a brake horsepower of 340, and a top road speed of 27 miles per hour.
The Crusader, I believe, was probably the most handsome tank ever produced. The amount of speed that it could produce was quite phenomenal. The anti-tank gunners and the mortar crews alike found it very difficult to range on it because it did move very quickly. You'd no sooner get your sight set on a particular point than it was off, and they didn't like it.
In terms of its gun armour combination, the 2-pounder or 40mm gun which it has, in terms of its armour piercing capability, is really quite good for 1941. By the time you get into 1942, the situation's beginning to change, and the penetrative power of the 2-pounder gun is possibly inadequate by that period. And also, you've got a problem that the 2-pounder gun doesn't fire high explosive, which you need for some purposes.
The problem with the Crusader in the Western Desert is partly mechanically unreliable initially, and it takes a long time to get that sorted out. Initially, we lose more tanks to mechanical breakdown than we do to the enemy. The other problem was the gun. The 2-pounder just wasn't powerful enough to be of any use against even the German Mark III. Mark IV would bounce off. Once the Germans start bringing in Panthers and even Tigers, and they do bring 25 Tigers over to North Africa in the latter stages, well, the poor old Crusader just doesn't have a hope.
The Crusader made its debut in 1941, when the campaign in the North African desert was reaching a critical phase. In September 1940, the Italian forces had steamrollered into Egypt. From December 1940, the British, Indian and Australian forces had doggedly pursued the Italian army. Their 2-pounder guns were suited to this task, and by February 1941, most Italian tanks had been knocked out. Neville Gilman was a tank commander with the 7th Armoured Division, otherwise known as the Desert Rats.
We arrived in Egypt at the end of August 1941. Italy had come into the war, you see, and Libya was an Italian colony. So the British troops had invaded Libya. They had really beaten the Italian army, and they went right back beyond Benghazi, by which time the British lines of communication were very stretched. With us, we had our tanks, which were Crusader tanks. The tanks were delivered by rail to us at Amrir, as the place was called. And then, in early November, we started to move westwards up to what we called the wire, which was the barbed wire fence which ran down the frontier between Egypt and Libya. And we had our first engagement on the 19th of November, when we encountered what appeared to be a formation of, we thought, Italian transport. Intelligence reports had been that it was Italian lorries. In fact, the lorries were hiding anti-tank guns, and the regiment went in and made a great charge, and there was a very heavy casualties.
Allied tank crews were starting to put the disaster at Dunkirk down to bad luck and lack of preparation. The German answer to the Italian debacle was defiant. They sent over their tank ace, Rommel, who promptly and brilliantly drove the Allied army back to the Libyan-Egyptian border. It was a shock for the Allies. There was another crucial reason why the Germans were enjoying success. Not only were their tanks protected with thicker armour and mounted with long-barreled 50mm guns, but they had also found a new devastating use for their anti-aircraft gun, simply known as the 88.
I'm sure we were hit by a German 88mm gun, which were the ones we were all terrified of, because they were converted anti-aircraft guns, and if they hit them, they just blew the tanks to pieces. I mean, they're enormous things, colossal muzzle velocity and whatnot. And the Germans, being very thorough, efficient people, they decided to convert anti-aircraft and turn them into anti-tank guns, which they used to enormous effect. One always hoped, and the vast majority of cases, you did bail out. I bailed out 3 times and got away with it. We had a sergeant who bailed out of 15 tanks and got away with it. The unlucky ones were the ones who were wounded and couldn't get out when the tank burned. That was the worst scenario of all. And of course you always had this at the back of your mind.
The problem for the Allies was not the speed with which their own tanks were being rushed into service, or the show of steel displayed by the Axis forces. The Germans simply knew how to use their tanks, to devastating effect.
The real German superiority, I think, is in the way they use their armour. The Germans were usually much better at concentrating their tanks on the battlefield. The British had a depressing tendency in 1941, early 42, to dissipate their armour all over the battlefield. You could almost say all over the theatre of operations, and this really wasn't any good when it came to dealing with German armour, which was much more concentrated.
We really thought that our tanks were absolutely the last word. We'd been sold on the idea that the Nuffield cruisers, the Crusaders, we knew they were extremely fast. They'd do 40 miles an hour on flat desert. We knew that the gun was small. Of course, the gun was minute, a 2-pounder gun, about 37mm caliber.
We kept on telling them in the desert that our tanks were puny little things armed with toy shotguns. We went out armed with something called a 2-pounder, which was a pathetic thing about that long. And when I fired first at a German tank, it went 500 yards and dropped in the sand. No question of hitting a tank. And if it hit the tank, it wouldn't have hurt it.
We watched our shells from our 2-pounder guns bounce off the front of German Mark III and IVs at 500 yards. They were using an extremely powerful 50mm gun on the Mark III, and the Mark IV had a 75mm gun, which would just come straight through the armour of a Crusader, even the frontal armour.
By the summer of 1940, it was painfully obvious that Britain needed a cruiser tank with a heavier armour and a bigger gun than the Crusader. As a short-term measure, the 6-pounder gun was fitted onto a modified Crusader, but this meant removing a member of the turret crew, when it was common knowledge that using a turret was a 3-man job. So in November 1940, the Department of Tank Design issued its specification for the new generation of tanks.
The Liberty had absolutely had it by the time, by the Middle War years. It was an engine that dated back to 1916. It was really well past its prime. The Meteor, on the other hand, was a derated Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with a supercharger taken off, a different transmission. But that was an engine that had been rated for 1,200 horsepower. It was well proved. It was a wonderfully reliable engine. And it did prove to be a fantastic tank engine. It was used in British tanks up until the late 1960s.
One of the problems of British tank design during this period, and funnily enough, it's a problem that reoccurs in the 70s and the 80s of British tank design, is we tend to underpower our tanks. Now, with the arrival of the Meteor, we're starting to iron that out. The Meteor engine was a derivative of the engine being used in the Spitfire, which was a very reliable engine. It was an engine which was actually, although more technical than what had gone before, was in a funny way, it was easier to maintain and certainly more reliable. So we're beginning to get an engine that's going to work.
The cruiser Mark VII, better known as the Cavalier, had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 6-pounder gun with 2 Beezer machine guns. Its armour was up to 76mm thick. Its Nuffield Liberty engine gave it a range of 165 miles, 410 brake horsepower, and a top road speed of 24 miles per hour. The Cavalier was never used in battle as a gun tank, as faster and more reliable Cromwells had become available by 1944. But it did see service as an observational tank and was used in this capacity by the Royal Artillery in northwest Europe.
The Cavalier was a natural attempt to improve upon the Crusader. It was meant to be better armoured and contained the potential for mounting a larger gun. The problem really was that you're still using the Liberty engine. And if you're up armouring and you've changed the hull design to a slightly larger one, then you're giving the engine several more tons weight to cope with.
By mid-1943, British General Staff had changed its policy on tank armaments. Experience in North Africa told that following a breakthrough, the real targets were anti-tank guns and dug-in infantry. So rather than the usual armour-piercing gun, what was really needed was a tank that could fire a decent high-explosive shell against these softer targets. Not only were the subsequent Cromwell Marks fitted with this new lethal 75mm gun, but the existing Cromwells in service were withdrawn and their 6-pounder guns replaced. Developed from the 6-pounder and incorporating some of its components, the 75mm gun used American and French rounds, meaning that tank crews could rely on a consistent ammunition supply. The second heavy cruiser tank to succeed the Crusader was, like its predecessor, called the Cromwell II. This name was changed to the Centaur.
Centaur's main difference from the other Cromwell variants was simply the Liberty engine. It was quite as simple as that. It was originally intended to have the Meteor, but unfortunately Meteor production didn't keep up with tank production. But it was entirely interchangeable. It was designed to be interchangeable, and it had the advantage over the Cavalier that it had the efficient cooling system.
It did serve in the Royal Marines support group on D-Day. They did advance inland quite a long way, acting as supplementary artillery.
The Centaur had a 5-man crew. It mounted a 6-pounder gun with either 1 or 2 Beezer machine guns. Its armour was up to 76mm thick. Its Nuffield Liberty engine was capable of a 160-mile range, a brake horsepower of 395, and a top road speed of 27 miles per hour. Had Britain finally developed a tank that could realistically take on the German Panzer Division? She had, but not in nearly sufficient numbers to have a chance of threatening the might of the German armoured force. So in May 1943, production of the Cromwell was transferred to Leyland Motors. The heavy cruiser A-27M, otherwise known as the Cromwell, needed a 5-man crew. It mounted a 6-pounder gun, 3 7.92mm Beezer machine guns, and another 75mm gun. Its armour was up to 76mm thick. Its Rolls-Royce Meteor engine was capable of a range of 173 miles, an impressive 600 brake horsepower, and a top road speed of 40 miles per hour.
When Cromwell was originally designed, it was intended to fight German tanks of the nature of the German Panzer IV with the short 75mm gun, or the later Panzer III variants with the long-barreled 50mm gun. And these type of tanks it was perfectly capable of taking on.
Now, unfortunately, it really came in about 2 years too late. And by the time it is in general issue, it's not a match for the Panther, and certainly not a match for the Tiger. But what it has got is speed. Now that is why when we land in Normandy, the reconnaissance regiments, which need to be able to move quite quickly, are armed with the Cromwell. Army tank brigades are armed with the Cromwell. Another good characteristic it's got is it's very good at going up hills. And when we get further into Normandy, of course there are hills. And the Cromwell was rather better going up a hill than the Sherman, although the Sherman was a much more modern tank.
On paper, the Cromwell seemed to answer the prayers of the hard-pressed British tank crews. But would it pass muster with the men in the field?
There are descriptions of Cromwell crews being briefed immediately before Normandy as they came home from North Africa, 7th Armoured Division, and were equipped with the new Cromwells. They had a lot of hope that they were finally going to get something very good. When they were briefed by their commanding officer on the strengths of German tanks, it was apparently a very, very sobering experience.
We sent complaints back to the War Office, and our generals certainly did. 1 or 2 resigned on the strength of it. But we didn't get a good tank until the war ended. A bit late.
They put the ramp down, and we came down off the landing craft. And of course, there was bodies everywhere on the beach. And I remember the driver, we were all on intercom, he said, "Good God, Corp, where do I go?" I said, "You've got to go straight on." I said, "But do your best." Now, what's worried me ever since was there somebody there alive, just lying wounded? Because you had no option. You just had to go straight to where you had to go, and if there was something in the way, there was something in the way. And you can imagine when you got out later on and looked at your tracks, that's my first initiation.
The Cromwell first saw action in the Battle of Normandy. Following the D-Day landings on the 6th of June, the 7th Armoured Division headed for the Calvados region, just south of the Seine Basin. The terrain could not have been more different to the desert. The area to the south and east of Caen consisted of open, rolling countryside, whereas the landscape to the south and west of Bayeux was a maze of small, sloped fields, boxed in with high, banked, thick hedgerows. Villages were connected by a network of narrow country lanes. For a tank that relied on speed and maneuverability, the Normandy campaign now presented a grim prospect for the Allied tank crews. This seemingly idyllic setting could not have been worse for the Cromwells.
We drove right up the middle, flat out, and then paused for a night, and went on in the morning and got to this little town of Villers. And our leading squadron had to take a high hill up the far end of it, which was frankly indefensible. I've seen it since. There was no cover, no woodland, no bushes, no scrub. And then the trouble started.
An entire British armoured division is brought to a halt and forced to withdraw by one understrength company commanded by a lieutenant. Even the stupidest, most newly joined second lieutenant does not send a column of armour up a single road onto a high ridge with trees either side. You are asking for trouble. Tanks are useless in close country. They can't see, they can't manoeuvre. What the commanding officer of the Command of Landing Yeomanry should have done was to dismount his infantry at the bottom of the ridge, clear either side of the road, and then send up his armour. Had he done that, they would have found Lieutenant Whitman and his Tiger tanks hiding there, rubbing their hands metaphorically and thinking that all their birthdays had come at once, which of course it had.
I'd pulled back into somebody's farmyard, and then I suddenly saw a bloody great German Tiger tank passing slowly across in front of me. But I'd let my gunner get out to spend a penny, so he couldn't have shot, and I wouldn't have helped if I had. So I put my wireless operator in the gunner's place, got him to load the gun, and decided to chase the Tiger, because the only way to get him with our feeble tanks was to hit him in the rear. So I said to the driver down the intercom, "Follow that tank." And he did. Trouble was, we followed him a bit down this main street, and the bloody man had met one of our other tanks down the other end of the street and had turned round. So we met each other facing at about 400 yards, which was for me murder. So I got in 2 shots because I knew he was there, but they just bounced off the front of his tank. He then had a shot and it didn't bounce off.
And when you got hit, you had exactly 12 seconds to get out the turret, because until you got out, the driver could get out front, but those in the turret couldn't get out until you did. And so you used to put your foot on the top like that and just throw yourself out and roll and hope that you were only going to hit the ground.
Our gunner was killed. The other man in front was killed jumping out. Driver got out, he was safe, and I was blown out the top, and I'd been wounded in the face, I didn't know it. And so I ran across the street. I grabbed the wireless, and I was able to tell the rest of the regiment what was going on.
An entire British armoured division is brought to a halt and forced to withdraw by one understrength company commanded by a lieutenant. Both British brigadiers were sacked. The divisional commander, Bobby Erskine, is sacked shortly afterwards, and eventually, during Operation Bluecoat, the corps commander, Bucknell, is sacked, which is not bad if you're a lieutenant.
Although the Cromwells were helped by their close support 95mm howitzer counterparts, they relied on speed to get out of trouble. A 17-pounder gun was developed, which it was assumed would solve all of the Cromwell's problems.
There was a problem fitting the 17-pounder gun into British tanks. The very big, heavy weapon, and the turrets of earlier British tanks were not really designed to cope with it. It was difficult to, in fact, it turned out to be impossible to fit an adequate turret on the Cromwell tank.
Attempts to up-gun the Cromwell to carry a 17-pounder failed miserably, and by late 1943 there was an acute need for a fast cruiser with decent protection and a gun capable of taking out the later German tanks. The first priority for this task was finding and deciding upon a suitable gun that could be mounted onto a Cromwell easily and quickly. This new tank would be built using as many Cromwell components as possible. Eventually, Vickers Armstrong came up with a design for a lighter and more compact version of the 17-pounder.
Most people regard the Comet as being a bit of a failure. I'm not sure it was. The Comet was never really given a chance. It comes in right at the end of the war. It never really sees very much action. It's then in issue with some units after the war, and it ends up being used as a tank target on a range because it's got quite a lot of armour. So it's a tank that was never really given a chance.
It took a while to get the Comet going, principally because British production efforts were aimed at D-Day. They were aimed at getting a maximum number of tanks into service, re-equipping all the units by the spring, early summer of 1944. So in many respects, anything that was going to come in either at the wrong moment in timing had to be held back slightly to ensure the success of the D-Day landings. So Comet didn't really come into service until the end of 1944, the beginning of 1945. It proved to be a very, very successful tank, but was a little bit too late to have a major impact on the Second World War.
Although the Comet was only rarely intended to be an up-gunned Cromwell, by early 1944 it became clear that over half of the tank would have to be redesigned. This finding was a setback. The Comet didn't reach units until Christmas 1944.
The Comet was a redesigned Cromwell, larger hull, similar suspension, larger turret, mounting the 77mm gun, which is a version of the 17-pounder gun. This, in fact, placed it on a parity with the German Panther, and probably slightly above parity with the Panzer, long-barreled Panzer IVs. In January and across 1945, the campaign leading up to the Rhine Cross, and beyond the Rhine, the Comet really tore away into the distance, and there wasn't an awful lot left to stop it, to be fair. It soldiered on until well into the 50s.
By 1945, Britain had finally produced a tank that propelled it to the cutting edge of cruiser design. After more than a decade of cutbacks and indecision that had blighted tank development since its heyday in the 1920s, Britain eventually produced a cruiser that earned respect.
The Cromwell was an adequate battle tank in all departments, but was not outstanding in any, and it really appeared too late in the war to have a significant effect on its outcome.
Its main weakness was the gun. In all other respects, it was quite a good tank. The armour could have been a bit thicker, but it was a good average for its day. When you look at the Comet was a very good tank, and had we had the Comet slightly earlier, perhaps things might have been a bit different.
A high proportion of the British tanks knocked out in the closing stages of the Second World War, 1944, 1945, were not knocked out by German tanks. They were knocked out by anti-tank guns. However, that was no comfort if you happened to run into a German Tiger tank when you were in something like a Cromwell or a Sherman. The Tiger tank definitely, in terms of its gun-armour combination, had a major advantage over you.
Had it come in 2 years previously, then it might have made a real difference. As it was, by the time it does come in, the Germans have moved on several steps. That said, it is reliable, it's very good at going up hills, it's fast, and it was really its speed that kept it out of trouble, rather than its protection or its gun.